when you talk of child rights programming, you consider the life cycle of a child. So initially now we're promoting the 1,000 days of a child. So the 1,000 days includes the pregnancy of the women, which is about 270 days, and then the rest until the 3 years old. Of course, when you talk of children, you're talking about 18 years old. But right now, since the Philippines is having nutrition problem, there's a lot of stunted children in the Philippines. So we would like to focus on the first 1,000 days of a child. And here, the intervention would be health, nutrition, and early childhood development. So that's the first 1,000 days. After that, we proceed until the rest of the life cycle, which talks about schooling. So that's the education component. And then you talk about child protection. Usually this goes up to 18 years old when children are adolescents and they need special protection in terms of abuse and other violence related to children. So that is unique in child rights programming. And usually, these are not really taken into consideration when you plan for children. There are the usual planning approach is being used, which may not be appropriate for a child rights programming. Yeah. So if you look at the life cycle, nutrition is one of the components. But as I've said, this is a critical issue now in the Philippines, which unfortunately we are not able to crack, given that the Philippines is rich in natural resources, rich in food, and there are still malnourished children. And of course, nutrition is not just about food. It has something to do with micronutrients, it has something to do with breastfeeding. So these are issues on nutrition that we should focus on, and there are also different ways of approaching it. For example, breastfeeding. This is a very challenging issue because you have milk companies such as your competitor in this particular case. You look at the advertisement that you get from formula milk. So how do you counter that? And make mothers breastfeed at least 6 months. So you look at it in a simple manner that, but if you look at TV day in, day out, billions of dollars are spent on advertising to promote milk formula. So this is a unique approach, a unique planning intervention that we should be able to take note and really plan well, because you are dealing here with very big multinational companies. The usual way of planning is, of course, sectoral, because resources are allocated per sector. So in terms of planning and budgeting, you get money for health sector, for education, for social welfare. So it's a silo type. Okay. The child rights programming entails intersectoral participatory planning process. Again, it's easier said than done. You really have to get the right people together, look at the perspective of a child, and get the stakeholders, especially citizens organization, NGOs, and the different departments in a government bureaucracy to participate in that process. This seldom happens. So if you really want to be child-focused, then participation is a requirement to be able to look at a child as an individual. Sometimes, yeah, we get sometimes criticized. Why do you look at a child as an individual? Why don't you look at the child as a family? Because you plan for the family. But the children has a unique requirement that needs special attention. So that's why we really advocate for planning for children. And this course is one way of doing that. We have different, of course, we have different levels of government, different ways of planning. National government, it's to the National Line Agency. So for instance, the SWD has their own plans and programs for children. And one of the biggest of this is the Pantawid. Okay, it's really a poverty alleviation strategy, but ultimately it wants to break this intergenerational poverty, especially for children. So they have a different process of planning there. Same with other national agencies. When you go down to the LGUs, I think the planning in LGU is really based on usually incrementalism and cut and paste methodology. So when I say incrementalism, last year's budget, last year's plan depends on this year's budget. For instance, if the budget increased, then a small portion of the budget is increased based on last year's budget. So it's like business as usual planning. So it's cut and paste. So meaning same activity, same budget, depending on change in the budget depending on the allocation this year. So if you want to break that cycle of planning, then we really have to teach them to do child rights programming. So and one way of doing that is really the life cycle approach. The government sector starts off with the budget. We know that. Although they would say that it's zero-based, but generally the plans and programs is determined to a large extent by the available budget. And they do that based on a conceptual framework or based on a national goal that they want to achieve. So to a certain extent, the national government now is doing a results-based planning, as you can see with the results matrix that they have, which is really a good thing with government. At the LGU level, they have not reached the level of sophistication as the national government do in planning. As I've said, probably very innovative local chief executives have really undertaken a results-based planning, like the government agencies. That's why UNICEF is really pushing for that. We're pushing for a results-based, evidence-based planning. So that is the key word now. So to be able to plan well, to plan better, you have to have the evidence, which means that given the life cycle, for example, less than 1 year old, how many are less than 1 year old? What are the programs for 1 year old? What are the interventions for them, and how much will it cost? And only then, if you know this data, will you be able to plan better. Again, there is a different approach for 0 to 3 years old. You have to know that. 0 to 5 years old. For those already in elementary and high school, and for adolescents. So it's very important that you have all this data to be able to plan better. So you need evidence to be able to plan your project and identify the activities that you have to undertake. And I think the local government units has not really been at that level yet in terms of evidence-based planning and budgeting. Yeah, results-based, of course. The bottom line is we should see all these things that we are doing on the child. What happened to the child? We spend lots of money doing activities, but in the end, you have to look at the child. Did the child, the situation with the child change? Are they out of poverty? Are they better now? Are they better educated? Are they well nourished now? So all these planning theories, planning parameters, all this budget, unless it's seen on children, will mean nothing. It's just spending all this money. Ultimately, it has to be seen on the child. That's why evaluation is a very important component of what we are doing now. So we do research and evaluation to make sure that all these efforts that we are doing really redounds to the welfare of children. Well, institutionalization is always the key, and usually it's the most difficult. You know, you introduce something. The partners, when we say partners, it may be government, CSOs, NGOs. would adopt it because you introduce it, you have money for it. After you're gone, after UNICEF is gone, what happens? It's not sustained. So there has to be a constant buy-in in the ideas, in the systems and practices that you provide. And only through results can you say that will partners or local government units will be able to sustain the activity. That's why in the Philippines, I think a strategy that works is the incentive approach, or because sometimes we're really gaya-gaya to a certain extent. That's why Galing Pook works, awards work, because we want to pattern what we're doing to practices that has been proven to be effective. So you use the same practice in your LGU, and then if it succeeds, then you say, okay, so you have to spread, you have to have a critical mass that does a practice so that everybody in the end will say that, well, since this works, then I will continue on doing it. Unless you are able to develop or form that critical mass of practitioners, sometimes it's called community of practice, of good practices on children, only then can you really institutionalize a practice. And this child rights programming has to have that inertia, has to have that movement, so that this becomes a practice that is prevalent in all LGUs.